primary role is to set up the cocktail bar here within the distilleries. We're lucky enough to have a full cocktail bar and more than just a tasting room, which is nice. We have even some beer and some wine and a little bit of snacks and things. We're reopening in about a week here from Memorial Day to the public. It's been, over a year. We've been doing to-go cocktails and such, and so we're very excited, but it's also a little bit hectic. And you'll notice the goal for today is I'm going to be able to bring you into the distillery and show you our space as we do the tasting. So just bear with us. So it's a little bit hectic. There's a little bit of boxes and things everywhere, but because we're just in the middle of a nice transition. So I'm just going to kind of start by flipping my screen around and starting by entering the front door of our building here and kind of give you the guest experience tour as if we were doing this in person. So right now, as I'm walking out the door, there's a little bit of our curbside setup, but on here. We're located in Montpelier, Vermont now. We were up in the northeast of Vermont, kind of a little bit hidden. Now we're smack in the middle of Vermont in the capital. And it's actually the smallest state capital in the country and the only capital without a McDonald's, which is nice. We're kind of proud of that. And if you were to come visit us, you could walk outside here and come visit our beautiful patio that we just have set up right on the Winooski River, which is one of Vermont's biggest rivers that runs through the state and goes all the way to Lake Champlain, which actually borders New York and goes up into Canada as well. So if you were to walk in, we'd invite you in, and we would notice here to our left, we have the full cocktail bar equipped with a bar top made of very grade granite. So it's a locally harvested from a local quarry granite, which is really nice. We have a lot of local kind of materials, and our whole kind of ethos is to do things as craftfully as possible and respect the makers and the farmers in every process. So this wood here is actually a spalted maple wood from a local craftsman made with some local wood. And then on this side is our retail space. It's all coming together. We still got some boxes we need to put away. And then let's go down the hallway. So this is a little bit of our like self-guided tour hallway with nice photos on the side. We're going to skip over some of it because I'm going to get to actually take you behind the scenes into the real distillery, where we'll focus on most of the tastings. But yeah, so why Barr Hill? The name Barr Hill comes from an actual nature preserve. This is the view from the top, and the little mountains on our bottles label is the view from the top of the nature preserve Barr Hill. And we were founded by a beekeeper here. Todd Hardy was a beekeeper for most of his life, and he partnered with our distiller, Ryan Christensen, and decided to make some spirits, some unusual spirits that really depict the terroir of this region using honey. So, bees can only fly so far. So in my opinion, honey is a very kind of regionally driven agricultural product. And so they started off with this very small, tiny 15-gallon copper pot still here. It was direct fire underneath, which made it pretty dangerous for ethanol is pretty flammable. So thankfully we're not using that still anymore, but this was the very small kind of barn looking establishment that we were in prior to moving into this big new facility. It was about 10 years ago we started, and then just a couple years after they started, it won a couple medals, gold medal and Gin of the Year in Hong Kong International Spirit Competition and the New York International Spirit Competition. So things just really started to take off from there. But let's go back to kind of the bees and to the honey. So I really, really urge you to now open your little jar of honey you have there and take a big old spoonful or whatever you've got and give it a taste. It's very, very good stuff. It's raw honey. So what is raw honey? Raw honey is unpasteurized, unfiltered. So it's never been heated. Nothing's been added. Nothing's been taken away. It's really this honey that makes our products. We say like you start with really good raw agricultural premium ingredients. It's relatively easy to finish up the process. That's why our slogan is land crafted instead of handcrafted, because we recognize that it's the land and the work of the farmers, and in this case, the work of the bees, that really do most of the real good work for us. Does anyone want to chime in and say what they think about the honey or what they're tasting when they're tasting the honey?
I taste gin.
You taste gin in the honey? Nice. I like that. Most people say they taste honey in the gin, but no, it's a great point. So in the honey, there's 150 wildflowers that the bees kind of harvest, and in gin there's many botanicals. So flowers are a botanical, and so it's actually a very good point that you made, because using the honey in our gin is really what gives that extra botanical depth instead of going out and using other botanicals. And we'll get to the spirits as I go into the inside of the distillery. There's our vodka is made 100%. I'm going to give you kind of like a little bit of a quick overview of all three here with the photos, and then when we get into the distillery, we can taste while we're actually looking at the still that made those products, if that's cool with you guys. If you can't wait, I totally feel free to give yourself a little sample now while we're chatting. So the vodka was the first spirit we made, and this was actually 100% fermented honey. Does anyone know what it's called when you have fermented honey as a beverage? Mead. Close, yes. Or maybe it's pronounced med in other places, but so mead is a honey wine, basically, or honey beer, if you want to call it that. And then when we take the honey mead to about 12% alcohol or so, then we distill that into this vodka. So most vodka is distilled from grain, much like the cheaper sources of sugar is what you need to ferment something and then to distill it. So a lot of times it's wheat or potatoes or corn. Ours isn't. Ours is distilled from a very kind of rich agricultural product, raw honey. And so we want to preserve that flavor as much as we can. It takes about 4 pounds of honey for each bottle of vodka. And it's a very special vodka. Most vodkas, are called neutral or flavorless or odorless. Since we're using this amazing raw honey, we want to be able to preserve as much flavor as we can. So it's still a vodka, it's still strong spirit. It's a dry spirit. There's no honey added afterwards. So it's not sweet. It's not flavored with honey. So it's not a honey flavored vodka. It's a vodka made from honey. So you still get a little essence of the honey. I get a little butterscotch when I taste it. I love the mouthfeel of this vodka. A lot of vodkas can be kind of dry and light, kind of astringent. This vodka has body. It's got some creaminess to it. It's got some richness to it. So if you're a fan of vodka on the rocks or just neat or in a dry martini or something, you would probably enjoy this. And then the bulk of our spirits, about 80% of everything we make, is Barr Hill gin, which is here in the middle. And someone, like I said, hit it right on the nose when talked about how the honey itself tastes like gin, or the gin tastes like honey. Is because gin is usually made with botanicals. And it has to have juniper berries. So juniper berries grow on kind of evergreen looking trees. They're like a little bit mixed between a berry and like a peppercorn type of berry. So they're a little spicy, they're a little citrusy, they're kind of foresty notes. And that's the primary flavor you get in most gin. Now, other gins can put a whole bunch of different other botanicals as well into their gin, like angelica root or even lemon peel. I've even seen some mushrooms or algae, and you can really go yuzu. You can do whatever you want. We decided to stick with just the one botanical in the still. But then here is where it changes. Instead of distilling and fermenting the honey, we actually add a little bit of honey after the fact. And we're not trying to make a honey sweetened gin or honey flavored gin either. We're just trying to get those botanicals from the honey to shine through. So in one way, it's one botanical, juniper berries, but in one way, it's also 100, 150 wildflowers. Or it's impossible to count them all. So we kind of use the phrase countless botanicals in our gin.
Hey, Sam,
yeah.
We have a great question in the chat from Martha and Tony. They're wondering if the honey should be refrigerated after opening.
It's a great question. No, you don't need to refrigerate the honey after opening. Honey should be shelf stable forever, pretty much. It has a high sugar content, about 82% usually. And they have found honey in tombs in Egypt that is still not rotten. So it's actually pretty incredible stuff. So you don't need to refrigerate it after opening. If we made it into a cocktail syrup and you liquefied it a little bit with water, in that case, you would want to refrigerate it. But it's a great question. Thank you. Moving on to our Tomcat gin. Tomcat is basically the same gin as Barr Hill. It starts off as the same gin as Barr Hill gin, but then it's aged in a barrel. So it's aged in new American white oak barrels like you see here. These are the same barrels you would use to make bourbon, but it's not a used bourbon barrel. It's a charred on the inside, so it's seen some fire, and it's toasted. So it's very similar to a barrel used to make whiskey. So our Tomcat is very much a mix of gin and whiskey, if you were to say, or it's in between a gin and a whiskey. So it's really works really well in an old fashioned and Manhattan, a little twist on a classic whiskey cocktail, because you still get that juniper spice, you still get the roundness from the honey, but you, oh no, I'm realizing I don't have my key on me. Can you bear with me for 1 second? I'm gonna stop my video to not make you sick. But now's a great time to ask any sort of questions while I just walk back and get my key from my colleague here. Apologies.
I had a question about the wildflowers that make the honey, if they're truly wild, or if you have sort of cultivated fields of specific flowers that you find particularly fragrant, or with,
yes, it's a great question. We work with a few different family apiaries around the distillery. It's about all the honey comes from 250 miles around us, and they're all very committed to using raw honey and keeping it as wildflower as possible. So, we can't control where the bees go. Obviously, they don't know borders. Some of this honey comes from New York, a little bit from Canada and such, and there is a little bit of a, cross-pollination, for lack of a better term, of wherever they're going. But typically the ethos of these family apiaries that we work with are really just kind of sometimes planting wildflower habitats, and sometimes just using kind of what's around them. I hope that answers your question a little bit. But it's so typical to our region here. There's a lot of apple blossom and goldenrod and red clover and these things that kind of grow in the Northeast. So if we were to use a honey from California or Africa or something, it'd be a completely different product for sure. Okay, so I brought you here behind the scenes. This is kind of cool because if we were doing the normal tour, normally we don't actually bring too many people back here. So because it's virtual and there's no one working right now, I'm able to kind of bring you into the space. I like to kind of start off and show our little quote that we have on the ceiling here. It says, "If not with milk and honey, certainly this land overflows with gin and whiskey." This came from a newspaper from Vermont in 1811. Back then, there was about 200 to 250 distilleries in the state. Everyone was making gin and whiskey. So we're here paying homage to that. Now I think there's about 28 distilleries in the state. Cool. So now's a great time to taste the vodka if you haven't tasted it yet. I'll kind of show you the process. So to distill anything, you need to start with something that's fermented. So we actually have all the equipment here that a winery or a brewery has, which are mostly these kind of fermentation tanks. There's a lot of pipes and bells and whistles and everything. It's a little hard to see. These are huge tanks that we fill with honey and with water. And we add a little bit of yeast, and yeast are little organisms, bacteria that eat the sugar in the honey and basically produce alcohol. They can only produce up to a certain point. So that's why you've never seen a wine, over 18, 19% alcohol. I've never seen a beer that high, because after a while, there's so much alcohol in the liquid that the yeast then kill themselves from producing too much alcohol, and then it stops fermenting. At that point, that all the sugars have been eaten out, so it's a dry product now, and it's needs to be distilled to basically concentrate that alcohol. So we take what's been fermented here into a mead, and we throw it first. It's a beautiful tall still, but we throw it first in this still here. It's a little fun fact, this copper pot still, this whole copper still in general, her name is Phyllis. It's Ryan's grandmother's name, and Ryan's grandmother, Phyllis, the real Phyllis, was not too fond of her grandson making alcohol for a living. But I gotta tell you, I'm pretty sure she would be very proud of us knowing that Phyllis here produced about 35,000 gallons of hand sanitizer last year at the beginning of the pandemic. We didn't have this in our old still, so this still has actually produced more hand sanitizer than any of the spirits, which is just kind of amazing. We partnered with a lot of breweries and wineries around here that had product going bad, and then we would distill that to a high proof to turn it into hand sanitizer. It was a crazy process. But going back to our vodka, Yeah.
We have a great question actually, especially while we're staring at the stills and talking about fermentation and history. Someone wants to know if the Tomcat is very similar to Genever or Geneva, typically from the Netherlands or from Belgium.
Sure. They're asking specifically if a Tomcat is similar to a Geneva, or So Geneva is a little bit of the grandparent of gin, and it was a barley base, which is actually the same usually base as a Scotch or something, and then there was some botanicals in there too. So the Tomcat is not really too much like a Geneva. I knew they make some aged Genevers out there, and the aging process doesn't necessarily define if it is a Geneva or not. So I guess the short answer is not really, but all gins are kind of similar to Geneva in a way. So it's a little bit of a tricky question to answer, I guess. So it's as much like a Geneva like any other gin out there would be, in the sense that the Geneva also has juniper, and it's also distilled with a botanical spirit. The bases are a little bit different, and the way they're made is a little bit different. But it's an excellent question. So we have two types of stills here, and they're connected. So we have a pot still and we have column stills. So technically there's really three columns here. The pot still, we can distill things to not as high of a proof. So things like whiskey or brandy, or the first run for vodka, which is called a stripping run. It's kind of the quick and dirty run, we call it. We throw it in here, we need, and then it heats very slowly. And what evaporates first are the alcoholic vapors, and then it goes up here, and by the time it gets around here, it starts to chill and condense back into liquid, and kind of goes through some pipes behind all there, and then everything is caught into these jugs at the bottom. What comes off the pot still in the first run of stripping run is about a 30-35% alcohol, spirit, and then we take that and we kind of redistill it in actually just one of these very, very tall columns. So it has 20 plates, and so to be qualified as a vodka, you have to distill to a very high proof. You have to distill to 190 proof, which is 95% pure ethanol. And to get to that high proof, you really need a column still. It's not possible to get there with this type of pot still. So in the column still, in every little viewing plate that you have here, you have really a little plate that goes across with little holes in it. And the vapors will evaporate slowly through one plate, and then touching a little bit the bottom of one plate, some of those vapors will recondense into liquid and fall back down. And the purest, kind of the smallest particles of the evaporation will go through the little holes, make their way up to the next plate. And then if they hit the next plate, some of it will hit the bottom of the plate, recondense into liquid. And the process kind of is little kind of mini, it's only like the purest of the vapors that gets higher and higher and higher proof. So by the time we get all the way up there, what comes off the still and comes all the way down is 190 proof. It's very, very strong stuff. Now, the first stuff to come off, and this is kind of a good example. Look, they actually even have these labeled as 1, 2, and 3. So the first stuff that comes off first is what we call the heads. And usually it's way more than these, but let's just look at 3 for fun. The heads, then the kind of the middle stuff that comes off of the still is called the hearts, and then the tails. And the heads is actually very dangerous for you. There's methanol alcohol. It's what makes moonshiners go blind in the woods. And the distillers are very in tune with what that smells like, what that tastes like. So they, by sensory, even if they have all of these gadgets, can you see? Yeah. Even if they have all these gadgets and these bells and whistles and such, it's still all done by sensory, by smelling and tasting these little cuts. So this is where the science meets the art of the distillation process, to kind of know where that cut is. To cut this and be like, okay, this is heads, now we're in the hearts, this is the hearts, and then we get to the tails. And the tails aren't that bad for you, but they do have some off flavors, some bitter flavors, and some esters and things that we don't necessarily want in our vodka. And so since a lot of vodka out there is trying to produce a super neutral, super flavorless, very kind of, very little personality type of vodka, what they'll do is they'll take as much yield as possible. They'll even cut in a little bit into the heads and even a little bit into the tails and take as much as possible. Then they'll filter it 5-6 times, and you'll notice they'll even start to advertise this filtered 6 times through charcoal and diamonds or something. But what we do to preserve as little bit of that flavor that we have left, remember, we're working with only about 5% of stuff that's not pure ethanol. So we're working with that much, so that small of a percentage of any sort of flavor. So we take actually not even the whole heart, but we take the hearts of the heart. So very conservative cut in the middle. And we do a very, very little type of filtration to not filter out any of that good stuff. So the other brands and bigger kind of yields and volume brands will keep a little bit of the heads, a little bit of the tails, but then they'll just filter everything out, and filtering out all that bad flavor from those, and then simultaneously filtering out any sort of good flavor that was left over. So we're trying not to lose that flavor of the honey. So what do people think after tasting the vodka?
Yeah, Sam, we would really love for you to share maybe some of your tasting notes on the vodka, and also
Sure.
we can discuss it too. Something in the chat, I mentioned that I can smell the honey, and Stephanie said that she gets a buttery, creamy taste to the vodka.
Oh, Stephanie, that's spot on. That's what the first thing I noticed when tasting the vodka, and Amy can chime in too, but is that mouthfeel, which is that creaminess. It's almost like it's a little bit thicker than some vodkas out there without being thickened or sweetened after the fact. It really has a way of, and I think that's because of the little amount of filtration that we do, and the fact that we only distill it twice. You know, a lot of every time you're distilling it, you're refining it to the point where it's becoming more and more pure ethanol, and you're distilling out a lot. You're leaving behind a lot of that flavor. So to technically call it vodka, you need to distill it twice. So we distill it only twice, and that's something we're proud of. You know, a lot of distilleries will talk about how many times they distill something as like a point of pride. But for us, it's the opposite, because we know that every time you distill it, you're losing more and more of that flavor. And since the flavor is that beautiful raw honey that you tasted at the beginning, we want to preserve that. But yeah, I get a lot of butterscotch notes, some light caramel notes, pops of a little bit of kind of citrusy spice at the end. But for me, it's really that kind of creaminess, that richness that you get. You know, when I like to taste spirits, I like to take a little sip and leave it in my mouth before I swallow, and kind of let my saliva dilute it. And that way you start to really kind of taste it without it burning your lips and your tongue. And you can really kind of get a nice feel for it.
Yeah,
Amy,
that's
what do
a
you-
great call, Sam. Another thing too, when you're smelling a spirit, something interesting is to, instead of smelling with your nose, if you just hold it in front of your nose and breathe in through your mouth, you'll actually be able to get more of those flavors without burning all of your nose hairs off from the high alcohol content. It's called retronasal olfaction, and it will actually help you to smell the spirit a little bit better and smell those nuances without being so intensely attacked by the alcohol on it. But I love this vodka so much. A lot of what Sam said is so important, I think, to what makes this vodka so special, let alone from the fact that it's distilled entirely from raw honey. But it also, when he was talking about the different cuts with the heads and the tails and the hearts, we make very narrow cuts on our vodka, which is also very important. A lot of times distillers will really push those cuts and try to get as much as they can into the final spirit, but we really want those hearts. We make those hearts really narrow, so that way it's the highest quality, and you also get a lot more of the flavor and less of that burning.
Stay in the left-hand corner. Don't touch it. Let it go. Let it go. You let it go.
Let it go.
Get your hand. Yeah, hit the escape button. Come on. Don't touch it.
We had a comment
Maybe
in
we
the
could mute.
Yeah, we had a
Go ahead.
comment in the chat here, Sam. Sam, I don't know if you're able to turn your camera on, because we have a few questions here that people.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, and then then you can get back to showing us how the other ones are made. But someone commented that the vodka was softer than other vodkas. It's kind of like a question. And does that have to do with only distilling it twice, or is it the honey? Like what gives it that texture?
Yes, a little bit of the base ingredient, which is the honey, the softness, or what people describe as kind of a smooth spirit, it is really the idea of those cuts that Amy was talking about, is that something that's inching its way closer and closer to including more and more of the heads, specifically, and a little bit of the tails, is what's going to make something give you that real like burn, that alcohol kind of vapor, that like that like strong like burn in the back of your throat or on your lips. It can be really intense and like so I would say that the reason why it's smoother and softer is because we're really just picking and choosing which parts we're deciding to keep, and we're picking the softest parts, which is the heart, in a romantic way.
Gotcha. And speaking of the parts, Monica asked, what happens to the parts that are not used?
It's a good question. So that's considered to be part of our stillage. Some things get used to make different things in the labs and tinctures, and some of it can get rethrown into like the next distillate and redistilled and such. But part of all of our stillage, and you know, especially things that have a lot of solids too, like the juniper waste, and when we're doing the whiskey and stuff, the rye and everything, it gets into a local biodigester actually that's helping to turn all of that into energy. It's helping to power the town. So it's all gets sent to like a very nice way to get rid of waste in a way that's going to produce some power for the town.
Wow.
But it's a great question. We get that question a lot. And, you know, it brings me to just mention the kind of, we were so lucky to be able to build a new distillery from scratch. We ended up saving about 83% of all the water that it takes to make a bottle of gin. We ended up being able to save as we built this one by reusing some of the water. A lot of water is used in distillation, mostly for chilling and for heating different things. And just by being way more efficient of how we capture that water and reuse the water that was used to cool something down, but then turned hot and then send it to then heat something else. I'd like to show you this big white tank behind me is huge. It's, you know, probably 6 times the size of I am, and it's basically like a big water heater battery. So all the hot water that we use gets sent into there, and it stays hot, and then we're going to actually be sending that onto our patio to be used as like a snow melt and to be able to heat some elements of our building, all using kind of this reclaimed heat. So we're excited about that new addition to the space.
Yeah, Sam, we also have some really great questions. I'm so excited for this this idea with this hot water heater. I love the reclaimed heat. I'm so excited to see this happening. We have some other questions going to mixing spirits. Jeremy wants to know that although we learned that the vodka and gin are made from the honey, is it considered inappropriate etiquette to mix the Barr Hill honey into the vodka and gin?
Mix the honey into the gin as an ingredient for a cocktail or such? Is kind of the question.
It is unclear. Although I will say often I do find people will just try to stir it right into their spirits while they're tasting. I would advise against doing that. Don't stir it directly into the spirit. You are going to want to mix it with water first if you're going to use it in a cocktail.
Sure, yes, that's a great question. We use honey as an ingredient in our cocktails all the time. You know, it's a famous cocktail, Bee's Knees cocktail. You can find all these on our website, but it's a gin, lemon, and honey syrup. So honey is very difficult to incorporate into cocktails, especially cold cocktails, because it is so thick, as you can tell, that it won't actually properly dilute in the cocktail. Now, if you want to take a teaspoon and put it in a hot toddy or a hot cocktail, it works totally fine, obviously, like a tea. But we like to make a honey syrup by using about 2 parts honey, 1 part water, and then just heating it ever so slightly on the stove to kind of incorporate that water and that honey to dilute that honey syrup to be able to then incorporate it into cocktails. So it is totally cool and okay to use it for cocktails instead of a simple syrup, for example. It's nicer to use a more natural sugar, and it works great.
Awesome. Thank you, Sam. That's such a great explanation. We also have another question about the bees specifically from Marcy. Marcy wants to know if we are experiencing the same bee issues as the rest of the country seems to be. I know down here in the DC and Maryland area, it's been a really rough winter for beekeepers.
Sure. I can't speak too much about the specifics of this year or the seasonality of things. But I do know that everyone knows that probably that bees are struggling worldwide. It has a lot to do with pesticide use and monocropping and things. Our founder, the beekeeper, calls bees the angels of agriculture, because it's about 1 in every 3 bites of food that you take depended on bees for pollination. So the short answer is yes. I think that everyone is experiencing it, but we're doing as much as we can to help fight that problem and building awareness. We launched a few years ago a campaign or a program or something, a fundraising program called Bees Knees Week, which actually celebrates the Bees Knees cocktail that we just talked about. It started off as bars and restaurants partnering. Now it's everyone, including retail stores and general folks like yourselves. Anyone who uses the hashtag Bees Knees Week and takes a picture of their cocktail during that week. It's the last week in September, I believe. Yes, it'll be that same week this year, the last week in September. And then Barr Hill helps to plant 10 square feet of wild pollinator habitat here in the States. And before that, we've been partnering with different types of like kind of Save the Bees organizations, and we've raised over $75,000, I believe, and partnered with these bars and restaurants in the general community. So it is really important to us to continue talking about that issue and to building awareness around it, because it's a legit issue and really something to be worried about. So we do the best we can to learn as much from our apiary partners. They've been really happy. Them specifically have been really happy to work with us because they can sell their honey to us in bulk. They can count on us as a customer. They don't have to worry about packaging or websites or marketing. They can really focus on the bees, which is what they really like to do. And every year that they work with us, they report less and less bees dying off, actually, because they're able to focus on what they want to do, which is actually be out in the yard with the bees and focus less on the sales and marketing sides of things of selling little jars of honey.
That's awesome.
We do have one more question about the gin. If there's any residual sweetness in the gin, it tastes
Great.
like there is.
Perfect. Let's. I was going to jump into how the gin is made right now. So
Perfect segue.
it all starts off in one of these barrels of juniper berries. This would be the fun part if you guys actually were here in person, but I'll have to describe it to you. So the juniper berries, I just kind of want to give you an idea of what they look like in person, I guess, in my person. They're really aromatic. As soon as I open the lid, it smells like a pine forest. It smells like lemon peel, lemon oil, a little bit of orange oil too, maybe some grapefruit. A little grassy, very lemongrassy. They smell incredible. And so what we do is we take the juniper berries, we grind them ever so slightly without pulverizing them. And then to get as much flavor out of them as possible, I'm gonna go up this little ladder. We put them in these buckets, which is basically making a tincture. It's actually filled with a high proof alcohol. So gin's a little bit different than like the vodka. Gin is actually takes a spirit that's already been made. So it's actually made with a neutral grain spirit to start, made from corn. And this is liquid in there. So there's a tincture, it's very high alcohol. It's extracting as much flavor as possible from the juniper. And then everything, the juniper berries and the alcohol they've been soaking in, go into this little pot still. And we have 3 of these. This one's name is Irene, I believe. And then we have Ramona here, and hiding behind the corner, she's a little shy, is Sherry. These are all grandmothers' names of our distillers here. And so we throw the alcohol that's already high proof in here, distilled from corn, with the juniper berries, and we distill that once. And some of it is in that tincture format, that tea format at the very bottom, and some of it is fresh junipers on a screen. So we're doing kind of a combination of a maceration distillation and a vapor distillation. So the vapor extracts different flavors than the maceration. So we're getting all kind of the high notes and the low notes of the juniper berry. Then it kind of gets distilled up. This is like a miniature version of the big copper pot still there. It gets distilled up, it chills here, comes down, and gets back into liquid and then caught at the bottom. So now what we've distilled is really just a single note juniper spirit. It's not actually Barr Hill until we've mixed it into this container with a little bit of honey. So there is a little bit of residual sugar to answer the question. We add the honey after the fact. It's not distilled in. We start to lose a lot of those botanical notes when we actually distill the honey in there. It's important to note here that we're not making a honey flavored gin or a honey sweetened gin. It's a very, very small single digit percentage of honey that goes into this. And it's really to get the botanicals, those countless botanicals of the wildflowers to shine through. So, you know, now's the time to taste the gin if you haven't yet. And so technically the fact that there is a little bit of sugar in it creates the category, it becomes part of the category called Old Tom gin. So London dry gin is what everyone's familiar with. You know, there's the Beef Eaters and the Tanquerays of the world. And we created something that was actually even created before that London dry, which is this style called Old Tom. And the funny thing is Old Tom was originally any gin that had some sugar added afterwards. And it usually meant it was kind of bad gin. They were adding a sugar just to make it palatable, make it drinkable, and not waste it. So we're taking this kind of very old school version of gin and putting our new age kind of premium agricultural spin on it by using this amazing raw honey instead of just some regular sugar. So it's technically an Old Tom style. And yes, I hope that answered the question. And if anyone else, and so now let's taste the gin. And you know, the gin is the first thing that comes out of my mouth when I explain the gin is usually how aromatic it is. It's incredibly like aromatic. You can smell it from kind of lower down. Has a lot of floral notes. So it's got these kind of light, bright flower notes at the same time as being this rich, round, also creamy mouthfeel. I love the shape of the bottle for Barr Hill gin because it really reminds me of what it tastes like. It's kind of this robust and rich and delicious, yet beautiful and delicate gin at the same time. What do other folks taste and think? I don't know if we lost Amy or not.
No, I'm here.
Oh, okay.
Hello. Yes.
Hey.
Hi.
Tastes like heaven is the only one I saw in the comments. Yeah, it's a gin. So, you know, some folks don't like gin. Here we have a joke that a lot of people in the world have had what we call a gincident, you know, back in college, when now they won't touch gin anymore for the rest of their lives. But as my Vermont sales rep colleague Sophia likes to say, and she's been working with the company for almost as long as it's been around, she says it's the gin that brings you in. Because it really does. It's a gin for folks who don't necessarily like gin. It's not as piney as some of them. It's not as astringent. It's not as dry. And so it's rich and it's delicious. You know, there's not many people that sip gin neat, but I totally do sip this gin neat. And it is, you know, I was a bartender before I started working here, and we had a little bit of an ongoing joke that if we wanted a drink to be in the top selling drinks, we would put Barr Hill in it and call it a day. It's kind of easy. It's almost too easy for cocktail makers to use Barr Hill sometimes.
Wow, Sam, I have to say, it's so floral, and I love that. I love like floral kind of cocktails and that sort of thing. And just, yeah, I mean, even just sipping it, like you said, neat is really good. And if anyone else wants to unmute and jump in, feel free. But we had a few comments in the chat that they just really love how aromatic and rich it is. This was Francesca. Delicious, definitely for sipping. So yeah, I love it.
And part of the whole experience, I actually don't remember if people in front of them have actual bottles or just little samples. But every bottle is
just little samples, yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, when you get your hands on a full bottle, every bottle is hand dipped in beeswax to seal it too, and that also adds so much to the aromatic kind of experience when you're drinking it at home. So I wanted to bring you into our barrel room to talk about Tomcat now. First,
yeah, and this is actually a perfect time to answer one of the questions in the chat about the Tomcat. Does the Tomcat have the same botanicals as our regular gin, or does that change too?
Yes. So the just to back up a little bit, why is it called Tomcat? Tomcat was actually a phrase based off the style of gin, which is Old Tom gin. Back in England, when the gin craze in London in about the 1750s, the government started to tax heavily gin makers because people were accused of drinking too much. And it turned out it was actually just the beer industry is putting a lot of propaganda against gin because they were a little jealous and competitive that people were drinking more gin than beer. But that's a different history lesson instead of a tasting. And they started to tax heavily the gin distillers. And so a lot of gin distillers, they were like, no, I can't do this. And they went underground. So it's kind of like the original speakeasy, actually, long before the prohibition in America. They started selling kind of underground gin. And the way they would do it, they have a little sign of a black tomcat on their door. Sometimes there's a little statue, actually, and you'd put a couple coins in the cat's mouth and you'd have your little glass. And sometimes out of the paw of the cat, they'd pour a little dram of gin and you'd take your little shot of gin and you'd be on your way.
Ask questions. I want to ask a question.
And that's what the name Tomcat comes from. So the question was,
I'm going to show you. This is the little cat placard on the side of the pubs that you would pour out through the cat's paw.
I don't know if we see it.
Oh,
I think I'm pinned.
oh
Sorry,
okay.
Amy.
Maybe never mind. But if you type it into Google, it's very easy to find.
Yes, and it's very cool, and it's a great story, and it's fun to talk about. And to go back to the initial question, the differences of the actual spirit of the Tomcat, and the answer is it's the same gin as Barr Hill gin, basically. The difference is before we add the honey, we age the gin. So it's just the juniper note for the botanicals. We throw it into a barrel, and it gets all of that color, all of that richness. You know, pour yourself the sample now to try it if you'd like. From the barrel. And these are new American white oak barrels that have been toasted and charred, just like a bourbon barrel. It's cool to point out that it's not a used bourbon barrel. A lot of, so just to clarify, I don't know how savvy folks are, but every spirit comes off the still completely clear. If it has color, if it has that brown color or any other color for that matter, but if it's brown, it's usually coming from a barrel. Ideally it's not coming from some sort of food coloring or caramel coloring or something, but an aged tequila or an aged rum or a scotch or a whiskey or this Tomcat is all getting its color and its flavor from the barrel. And these are notes, flavor notes that are very much associated with whiskey, like vanilla notes and caramel notes that you get. You still get the juniper spice. You still get that rich honey note that we add through again after we finish aging it. So we still get the countless botanicals from the honey, but now we've added a whole dimension of these rich kind of darker, deeper notes, campfire notes of sitting around in kind of the wintertime and drinking something that has, like I said, a little bit of the coconut notes and butterscotch and caramel and vanilla. This is a really cool gin for folks who are whiskey lovers or bourbon lovers. Like I said, it works really, really well in a Manhattan or an old-fashioned cocktail. But yeah, most of our barrels are coming from different coopers, and it's kind of fun to point out how different barrels, for multiple different reasons, produce a product that's completely different. This barrel over here could have come from a tree that was growing a little bit in altitude versus this barrel that was growing on a tree next to a river or next to somewhere else. And then not only where the wood comes from, but the difference in which cooper made it and how they made it. And then now, even just in this room, the barrel down here is going to be at a much colder temperature than the barrel up there. That one over there might be closer to the draft, who knows? So we have our barrel. He describes himself as our barrel buddy, our barrel blender, master blender. He actually has to go through and taste each barrel periodically, and then he has a whole tasting sheet of notes. He says, okay, this one, much more cinnamon notes. This one has a lot more vanilla. This one's not aging as fast. And then he takes it bits and pieces and puts it all together as a puzzle, and will blend a lot of the barrels together to make what we call Tomcat. So the blending process is super important. Every barrel, sometimes we do release kind of single barrels that we like just alone, or a restaurant sometimes buys the whole barrel that they've come in here and picked themselves. But it's a very important process, is that blending process. We have different size barrels. Since it is a gin, it ages much differently than a whiskey. We age for about 6 to 10 months, depending on the size of the barrel. And the little barrels, will impart much more wood notes, age in a way much faster. There's much more surface area of wood to liquid. So we use the little ones to blend in as well. And then we're working our way up to these bigger 50-gallon barrels. Any questions while I'm in the barrel room? I wish you guys were here. It smells so good of oak and honey at the same time. It's one of my favorite rooms.
There's definitely a couple of people who would love Andrew's job if he ever chooses to leave. I think a couple of people perked up at that. There was a question if we reuse the barrels or what we do with the leftover wood.
Yeah, it's a great question. So as far as I know, we're the only gin distillery that actually ages gin in new barrels, and barrels are very expensive, but we wanted to impart this really rich flavor. We didn't want just a slightly aged version. Here, I'll turn the camera on, sorry. We didn't want just a slightly aged version of our gin. We wanted to create kind of a standalone product, and bourbon also does not reuse barrels. That's why most aged products out there in the world are aged in previously used bourbon barrels. But we always use new ones. And when we're done with it, we usually sell them to other makers out there, cider makers, or a lot of breweries are aging beer now in different barrels. And it's very cool for them to get a barrel that's not a bourbon barrel, that's actually a gin barrel that actually has some juniper notes to it. So they really can create some really cool beers. And we even have a maple syrup maker that ages some maple syrup in a Tomcat barrel. So we kind of unofficially call that our stray cat series, because once they leave the distillery, they're kind of just running wild and we don't know what happens to them. Sometimes they become furniture, we actually just turned most of them into outdoor patio furniture for our reopening next week.
Amazing. Those tables look so beautiful. I'm so excited to see that. We do have another question about the alcohol content, if it's the same in both of the products.
Sure, it's a little bit different. The regular Barr Hill is 45% alcohol, I want to say. I'm struggling if it's 45 or 46. And the Tomcat is a couple
45,
degrees, it's 45, and I believe the Tomcat is 43. So it's a little bit different. The flavors of the wood can impart some different things. So we decided to proof it down, because you create spirits at a higher proof, and then we always proof it down with reverse osmosis water. And we decided to proof down the Tomcat a little bit more, and knowing that it's a little bit of a spirit more for sipping, and it just kind of you got a little bit more of all the flavor notes for that. And the vodka is at the lightest. The vodka is at 40%. I was going to show you real quick just the bottling line, because I always find it interesting. It's more interesting with people here, actually. But
there's some really amazing tasting notes happening on the chat as well, like some almond and vanilla, or almost like a menthol eucalyptus afterwards.
Very nice.
I always whenever I taste it, I can always picture walking through the forest in the fall after it's rained, like just the freshly fallen leaves, and like that fresh earth. It has this beautiful quality to it.
I love that. I love the almonds and the it's kind of like from the barrel, but the eucalyptus and the other menthol notes are kind of from the juniper. So it's a really cool mix of flavor notes. Nice job.
Yeah, absolutely. Tim would like to know what proof we age the gin at.
We age the gin at the higher proof. I don't know the number. I will try to get you that information, actually. If I had to guess, it's probably somewhere around 120 proof, about 60-65% alcohol. Usually just because when I've tasted barrel samples, it's usually around that hot. So it's not quite as high as the vodka, but it's high in that kind of 60% alcohol range. And then when we take it off, and because it's at that high proof too, it's extracting the flavors of the wood a little bit faster, and it works.
Yes, absolutely. Oh yes, so many great tasting notes rolling in. More cinnamon on the Tomcat, and also tasting on the regular gins, more herbal and lavender notes instead of it being super piney.
Yes, a lot of lavender is a great note for the first gin. So here, a lot of these is done by hand. We're automating slowly, but it's still very much a big team job to bottle here, 6 bottles at a time. Come around here, and this is a little capper that they put right here, and it caps it. And then they put a bottle on here to put the label on it. And then we put it down this conveyor belt, which we actually just got for COVID to keep people distanced. And then here by hand, every batch number and year is written on every single bottle with a little Sharpie. And my favorite part, the very sophisticated tool of crock pots filled with beeswax that we dip each bottle into. Of course, it's stuck. I want to show you it's dried now because no one's here, but this is usually, you know, at a slow melting, and we'll dip by hand each bottle in the beeswax twice. And then we'll
let me tell you, if you've never smelled melting beeswax, it is one of the most beautiful smells. The whole distillery smells like it. It's one of the things that imprints on me so much every time I get to visit the distillery. But if you get a bottle, even when your hand warms up the beeswax just from opening up the bottle, you can smell it every time you open the gin or vodka or Tomcat.
That's right. Here we still have some bunch of pallets filled with hand sanitizer. Visit our website if you're interested. We even do bulk amounts if you work for a company. Big barrels all full of honey there. Different sorts of things there. Little staff kitchen. There we go. I've made it through pretty much the whole distillery. I'd love to hang out a little longer, and if anyone had any questions about what we learned today, or any tasting notes, or any questions at all about distillation or cocktails or anything, or Vermont, I'll do the best I can to answer.
Yeah, there's Stephanie wants to know, how many people does the distillery employ?
It's a great question.
I think we're at 50 now. 55 maybe?
Yeah, 55 company-wide. So we're actually distributed in about 32 states and a couple countries. And so we have folks like Amy who aren't living in Vermont. I would say in the actual distillery, or folks that work in Vermont now. Not everyone's coming into the distillery because of COVID too, but a good 25, 30 folks probably are employed here in Vermont alone. And then, we've got some folks stationed in California, in Florida, in Maine, Massachusetts. Where am I missing? I used to do some work up in Montreal for us. Yeah, but that's a great question.
Yeah, there's about 12 people across the country like me. I'm actually in a parking lot right now. I just finished a tasting. But
seems like there's a lot of birds in the background there.
There are. Can you hear them? Good. That's better than the trucks driving by.
No, I hear the birds. I can't see you because I'm pinned, so I just keep picturing you like in some sort of garden with a bunch of birds flying around.
Oh, that's much better than next to the trash cans. Perfect. Great. We'll go with that. Great. Yeah, if anybody has any other questions for Sam, I will say that Sam very regularly teaches cocktail classes, which have shifted to virtual, but he actually was the first person to teach me about cocktails almost a dozen years ago. How many years ago was that? I don't even remember.
Yeah, at least 8 or 9.
At least 8 or 9. Yeah. Back when I was living in Vermont, he was the first person to make me fall in love with spirits and cocktails. And the history of it all is so impressive. So he's very knowledgeable. So any questions that you have about how to turn these spirits into cocktails, even, or anything about Vermont in particular, if you have any questions about that as well. I will say that in DC, there's a classic cocktail that is unique to DC. It's actually, DC is one of only 2 cities in the whole country that has an official cocktail that is recognized by the government. New Orleans has a Sazerac, and DC has a Ricky, which was named after Colonel Ricky at the Shoemaker Hotel downtown. In the early 1900s, Colonel Ricky was really warm one summer in the middle of July, as it tends to get here in DC. And he said he wanted he wanted something really refreshing. So we like to call this the air conditioner in a glass. It's very, very simple. It's just gin with soda water and a half of a lime. And I really think that Barr Hill gin is the perfect gin for this Ricky. What particularly makes it so refreshing is the fact that there's no sugar added to it, but it can also be a little bit stark with other gins. But that little bit of perceptive sweetness from the honey really helps to round out this cocktail and make it the perfect cocktail for a DC Ricky. So if you're feeling a little hot this summer, I know it's 90 degrees today, although I do see some people enjoying being outside. So it's definitely something to think about, and doesn't require any cocktail making skills.
It's actually almost 90 today here in Vermont, believe it or not. Took a while. I feel like there was snow on the ground a couple weeks ago, and now it's finally just like middle of summer.
Marcy, did you guys have a question? I saw that you had been unmuted.
Yeah, I tried to unmute, but it's not unmuting. Can you hear me? No?
Yes.
Can hear me. Oh, I didn't see the green flashing. What was their question?
There's a lot of citrus, it seems like, in the cocktails you recommend. There's any particular reason for that?
It's a great question. I mean, there's like there's a lot of citrus in a lot of cocktails. I guess there's kind of like two basic styles of cocktails in my mind, and in kind of the industry, and one of them is the classification of sour cocktails that include citrus, and the other one are cocktails that are spirit forward. Sometimes they're called more aromatic cocktails. Those are like your boozier kind of Manhattans, martinis, Negronis, old fashions, and so you'll find some of those as well on the website. But a lot of cocktails are a good balance between something strong like spirit, something acidic, and something sweet. It works really well, particularly with gin, because the botanical notes, as Amy was just explaining in the Ricky, have this like fresh appeal that works just really well with citrus. Juniper itself has a lot of citrus notes, yeah, it works. They work really well with a lot of citruses. Balance them with a little bit of some sort of sweet syrup or something, but we like to call it nightly balance, not necessarily overly sweet or overly sour for that matter.
Okay, so
I have a question about making a martinis. When I first started making martini and drinking, making them when I was 10 for my dad, not drinking them until I was significantly older. Making a martini with the Barr Hill gin is completely different to me than making a martini with a London Dry. How would you make a martini? I'm more likely just to put it on ice with a lime. I wouldn't dilute it with seltzer water or club soda. That seems just wrong. But how would you make a martini? Like vermouth to gin, and what kind of vermouth?
Totally. If I'm making a Barr Hill gin martini, I like to make a little bit of more of a wet martini. A lot of people are averse to vermouth, but more and more people are now understanding what vermouth should taste like and how to take care of it and keep it in the fridge and not let it go bad, because it is like a wine basically. It's a wine-based spirit. So I like to do like 2 parts gin, 1 part vermouth, dry vermouth. And then I even add a little bit of orange bitters, and instead of olives, we'll do a lemon twist, so it works really, really well with a martini that calls for a twist. It gets a little bit funky if you're going to do a dirty martini with the gin, because of that little bit of honey that's in it. Some people like it, and kind of the sweet and salty works a little bit for some folks. But I kind of like that. Our preferred martini recipe is 2 to 1, we call it. So it's relatively wet martini with that lemon twist for sure. And with the vodka works totally well as well.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
One of my favorite things too with a martini is to put a couple drops of absinthe in it. The florality from the absinthe can kind of act as an aromatic for a martini. That's really nice with the gins or the vodka.
Nice. That's very nice.
Good.
Did that answer your question about the martini?
It did indeed, and I'm happy to report that that's kind of where I go when I do. I first thing I tell bartenders, I'm not afraid of vermouth because people are afraid of vermouth, and martini
Nice.
is vermouth. But I usually do the twist instead of the olive, so I'm glad I was headed the right direction. So thank you.
Good. Glad to hear it.
You're good.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I guess you can't hear me.
We
you
can
able-
hear you.
I apologize if it was a little choppy walking around with the phone. Always is. I hope it didn't make anyone too sick or dizzy. But you know, please reach out, Amy, if you don't mind, because I can't pull up the chat now. If you want to put my email
Yeah, I'll do that right now.
in the chat, and my Instagram is @sam_Nelis. You can follow me. We post a lot about cocktail recipes and different ingredients to use. And if you ever have a question about cocktails in general, or gin or spirits, or coming to visit us in Vermont, you know, shoot me a message. It's actually Sam_Nelis. Sorry, Amy.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
I do have one other quick question, and I don't mean to be dominating the conversation here. Are you guys going to be at the Philly
please.
Flower? Are you guys going to be at the Philly Flower Show again this year?
I think probably
if
yes.
the flower show is happening, I know. So my Mid-Atlantic counterpart, Amy Casale, loves that flower show. She does it with her sister every year, and she's been with the company almost since the very beginning.
It is happening. It's outdoors this year.
Oh yeah.
And, I don't know, it was how many years ago? Several years ago, we were at the 5 or 6 years at the flower show, exhausted and stunned to find you guys at the very end.
Nice.
And it was awesome. We helped them finish off those bottles they didn't want to carry back.
Nice. Yeah, we hear a lot about that.
But somebody had to do it.
Somebody had to do it, and we just volunteered. Yeah.
It's a big event, huh?
Yes, it's a huge event, and it's all weekend, I believe.
Yes.
It actually goes, I think, for 4 or 5 days. It goes on for quite some time. So it should be beautiful. It's in a park this year, so everybody can be outside COVID wise. But I think you guys should have your hand sanitizer there. If they're looking for hand sanitizer, get your
Oh, yeah.
even if you
This
guys aren't
is-
there with your deliciousness. So thank you.
No.
Thank you. It's been wonderful.
Of course. Well, it was
Yeah.
nice hanging out with you folks today, and thanks for having me. And like I said, bearing with me for getting my key card. And but I enjoy this, and I hope to do it in person someday soon.
Big thank you to Sam and Amy here from Barr Hill.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Have a great
Have a
night.
good evening, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you so much. Have a great night, everyone.